everybody. Welcome back to It's Time. Linsly and I are really excited to bring you kind of a unique view and perspective on where we're winning in our health battles and where there's opportunity in our health battles.
Yes, because I feel like, like with everything in the news cycle, right? It just gets really noisy and it vibrates, and you're like, where does really the relative fact base fall out here? And, especially all the news around Maha and, gosh, we're like, I think I've read headlines that say, we're in the worst shape that we've ever been in our lives, that we are the sickest generation in America. And a lot of that is there's opportunity to improve for sure. But some of it's like, I just wanted to get back to the fact base together and have you and I talk about this around if you're thinking about your health and wellness, like what's worth celebrating and therefore trying to make sure it stays in place.
Absolutely.
And then where are there opportunities that are actually that's worth our energy to invest for the lever of change, right?
I love that because it's easy to get bogged down in the negative and not know where to start. And
Yeah.
it's especially for those of us that are really trying to just frequently hear this message how we're so unhealthy, we're so unhealthy, we're so unhealthy. And it can get really discouraging.
Yeah. And I feel like, you hear all these sort of like anecdotal data points, like whether it's blue zones or it's like, way back in the day, everybody's food was not processed. And so they were walking everywhere and everybody was so much healthier. And there are nuggets of truth in that are worth amplifying. But just the blanket statement that everything was healthier is just inaccurate.
Correct.
And so I think we got to celebrate the health that is on the table, thanks to the science developments over time, and make sure those stay in place.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the one other, maybe my other public service announcement that I promise I won't get on my soapbox too long about is just, again, please be conscious of where your information is coming from. And there are so many wellness influencers that really have little to no training in these areas that they are really vocal about and are painting themselves as absolute experts. And even using the word doctor sometimes, just make sure, don't confuse the word doctor and physician.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Because I think there are many ways to become different types of doctors. And it's very confusing when people say, I'm a doctor, and they might have gone through a very different type of training to call themselves a doctor, but they're actually not a physician. And
Yep.
so just be careful where your information is coming from. And it's not to say that people can't self-educate and become very knowledgeable, but just have things in the back of your mind.
Yep. I think related to that, because one of the things as we go through these, especially polarizing things, right, that I have found helpful to me is something actually a business school professor, Lee Walker, taught me 30 years ago, which was, what would I have to believe to be true in order for this point of view to hold? And then to flip it on its head and be like, and what would I have to believe to be true in order for this point of view to be negated? And it helps you just sort through where the fact base sits. So I know we were going to take a little bit of that approach in our conversation today. It's like, if you just put the assertion out there, we are the sickest generation since the beginning of time, or whatever it is you see in the headlines, what would we have to believe to be true in the fact base to have that hold? And what actually would say, that's not true? So we can kind of look at those. And then in our show notes, we'll have all the citations of the research if you want to go deep on it. But it just kind of helps ground what it is, what's worth worrying about and what's worth letting go and investing in the areas that need change.
Absolutely. All
Because I
right.
think that the one that kind of kicks it off overall is just like, yes, you know what? Life mortality continues to increase. So it's rebounded since COVID. It's rebounded since the opioid crisis. And it's up roughly a year since 2022. And it sits at 78.4 years in the US. It is a factual base that we are lower than other countries. 82 years old is a lot of the higher aging countries, especially the European base. And so there's opportunity to learn there. But overall, in the United States, since I think it's 1885, we've gone from 40-year-old mortality rate to 78.4
Right.
years.
Right. And I think advances in all aspects of life contribute to that, right? And so we don't want to gloss over like all of the amazing advances, whether it is in how, clean water and how how we take care of our food sources or preventative care, whether that is vaccination or screening, all of these things that are really keeping people healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's just kind of top line exciting. And then there were some specifics around mortality rates that have really changed that were new news to me.
Yeah. So I think, our cancer mortality is way down. And this is for, again, a variety of reasons. One, we know the lifestyle triggers and levers that we can pull to try to avoid some of this. I think one of the coolest studies I just read was about, I don't want to say this wrong, but it was basically and I'll come back with the specifics, but it was basically that exercise, when muscles are contracting forcefully, they're releasing certain cytokines that are very anti-cancer. It was with breast
Oh, that's
cancer.
cool.
And so
Yeah.
these women that were really active post breast cancer lowered their risk of occurrence because of this exercise induced cytokine release that attack cancer cells. We know, so yes, we've made huge progress in the way we treat cancer, which to some and many is still rather, I'm going to use the word barbaric, because it is. Chemotherapy is brutal. Radiation treatments are brutal. But
Yeah.
we're making progress, and people are not only surviving, they're thriving after these diagnoses again. And we're limiting the risk of recurrence. I think the other thing that we have done is implemented screening protocols. And
Mm,
so mammograms, colonoscopies, these routine health maintenance things that really lead to diagnosing early, which
yeah.
means we need less toxic treatments and have a better chance of survival.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty exciting. I mean, so I think some of the data that we saw was like 5 million deaths have been averted in the decrease in cancer rates kind of through 2022. And I think just from a public service announcement, you raised it, that the recommendations for mammograms and colonoscopy getting younger remind us what are those recommendations right now for our folks listening?
So it's interesting. There's two different recommendations by different societies for colonoscopy.
Okay.
So the more conservative one is starting at the age of 50, and then depending on your findings determines the follow-up. So if you have a clean colonoscopy, meaning no polyps, they didn't find any suspicious lesions, they say you're good for 10 years. If they find something, depending on what they find, then it usually shortens to a 3 to 5 year window. The American Cancer Society has said starting at age 45. And
Okay.
so I would say, as these tests can be expensive, checking with your insurance provider to see what they're following, and or working with your physician to know which is going to be covered, and based on your risk factors. Obviously, there are a couple of genetic and familial predetermined conditions where you can have a much elevated risk of early colon cancer, and that's kind of a separate scenario. The other thing that's really coming on is some of these at-home testing. There's Cologuard, there are some other in-home testing that can be done more frequently. It's not as sensitive and specific as a colonoscopy. However, it can provide some of that in-between care. And if there is a positive found on those, to trigger a colonoscopy earlier rather than later.
Yeah. That's good. All right, good to know. And I know this one is our kind of our number one cause of death, especially for women still. So it's mission critical to pay attention to it. But it was, at least to me, kind of good news to see that the rate of heart disease mortality has fallen sharply since the 70s,
Yeah.
right? Especially for age adjusted heart disease, like it's down something like 65, 66% from 1970 to 2022. But heart attack deaths being down about 90% in that time span. That's super encouraging.
Yeah. So I think, a few reasons there. One is we understand the contributors to heart disease much better, right? So we understand cholesterol, we understand blood pressure, we understand genetics. So we've made such progress in all of these areas that, again, it comes back. It's much better to prevent than to treat. And so if we are aggressive about managing blood pressure, whether that's lifestyle, and when lifestyle is no longer sufficient, adding in a medication. Same with cholesterol. We also know the genetic components of cholesterol too, that for some people, no matter how much they optimize lifestyle, medication is going to be warranted.
Mhm.
I think we've also advanced screening when it comes to that. If your cholesterol hits a certain profile and you fall into a certain risk category in the 10-year risk score, we're much more likely to recommend more advanced screening. So things like coronary calcium scans or even angiography. And then another really interesting thing is the prevalence of bystander CPR, AEDs, all of these things that are increasing survival of people who have heart attacks or have an arrest, that their pre-hospital kind of chain of survival is
Right.
greatly enhanced compared to what it used to be.
So that's so great. And I love all the conversation. I think you've been just a champion of this around helping people recognize the signs of a heart event
Yeah.
earlier so they get in and get care and increase their likelihood of survival, which is
Yeah.
amazing. And then something I just learned about, kind of this is tangential, but I was like, oh, I wish I had known, is that a lot of the conversation, because we've got teenagers with acne, right? So a lot of the conversations going on right now around Accutane are around the long-term effects it has on raising your LDL.
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that. And so I do now. And of course, that's something I'm always trying to work through with cholesterol, is I think there might be a lot of people in our cohort who were on Accutane
Mm-hmm.
as teenagers. And it's just worth having a conversation with your medical partner about, well, what does that mean for me? Do I need to kind of track this at a different level?
Oh, that's a great call out. Great call out. I think, we obviously have our stance on this and there's lots of various opinions. I think the true science still reports vaccine preventable death is,
I
I
mean,
mean, it's huge.
yeah. I mean, the stats on that was staggering me. It's like, okay, it was 100 and 1,000 babies died, 100 and 1,000. So 1 in 100. And then now it's 7.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that is just remarkable. So, the being mindful to the cliche and expression is so kind of relevant now, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's research to be done, and there are places where there's probably some fine tuning. I'm certainly not a scientist or a medical expert, but the data shows that infant mortality has just come down.
Absolutely.
And to risk that kind of opening back up that Pandora box feels a little scary.
And I even think, vaccines later in life, I think there's good data supporting coming out now, even about the shingles vaccine.
Oh, yeah.
It's lowering your risk of dementia. And so I think that I think we're learning all the time. Hopefully science will continue to be funded that we can continue to learn about this. And, there is probably there becomes a natural skepticism when these diseases have been eradicated. And so you can see how this idea, when nobody sees these diseases, then obviously the adverse effects of vaccination become amplified because these diseases are basically gone. So that it's not like there's not a comparison that actually makes sense to say, what would the mortality rate be if we weren't vaccinating at all, compared to this number of adverse events that they're trying to link to vaccination. So I think that you just kind of get lulled into these diseases are not that big of a deal because, I know one person that's had polio.
Well, but to that point, because I know we've been talking about my father-in-law, Chris's dad. He's an example of somebody who did get polio, right? And it's like he survived it, but now at 90, it is what he's having to navigate again. It didn't ever go away, So even if we survive some of these diseases, they're not out of your lifespan question. That is what he's wrestling with now as a 90-year-old. It's come back. His immune system's declined. He's 90, polio. Okay, so then the other one that I love this one because people talk about the impacts of climate and the environment and where we're going forward. But looking back, because I moved to LA in 1995, and that's always the example people talk about. But is that our air quality is so much cleaner than it was decades ago. So the natural concentration of the pollutants, carbon dioxide, everything that is just in the yucky zone of our airflow has been down steeply since like the 1990s, especially the 1980s.
Yeah. So I think, again, I agree with you. Hopefully we don't slide backwards. I think there's been so much great progress, and it's all of our ecosystem. We talk about being outside and exercising. Well, if you're not able to exercise in clean air, you're not getting as much benefit, right? It's like when there's fires or acute periods of active pollution, and then you get these warnings not to be outside. So I think, same thing when it comes to our water and our soil, like we want to eat these clean foods, and that we know that really contributes to our health. But so we need to make sure that we continue to have an environment that stays clean as well.
Yeah. Now this one, when we saw this fact, I was like, gosh, I hope it continues, is that the smoking rate is at kind of, historic lows, with adult cigarette smoking falling from, 42% down to like 11%. And again, as we talk about our aging parents, my father-in-law and my mom were unfortunate to be born in a time when they didn't understand the damages of smoking. They were responsible in their 50s and stopped, but by that time, the damage was done. They'd smoked for 30 to 40 years, and now in their 80s and 90s, that's the other thing that is basically going to make their end of life challenging, is that their lungs just can't ever fully recover from that. So the good news is that smoking is down. The thing I still worry about is the vaping replacement and, how that is. like you
Yeah.
said, potentially that benefit. But
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, not only is like the direct damage, COPD and lung cancer and smoker, we've learned so much about those diseases and how you can really mitigate a lot of that risk being a non-smoker, but also back to our cardiovascular disease, what it does to our blood vessels and our heart and all
yeah,
of our organ systems. So yeah, that's just, I think, an amazing example of really, identifying something that's toxic and doing really good awareness about that.
yeah. Yeah, because that is when we talk about with my mom's health challenges. She's got the congenital heart failure and the COPD, both of which are complements of smoking.
Exactly. So I guess, the other thing is that this is important, I guess, to us as parents of young drivers.
Yes, yes, yes.
We've improved our traffic safety. I think we've improved the safety of our cars. We have
Yeah,
seatbelt laws. Like all of these things really have lowered the amount of traffic deaths.
yeah. So that is a fantastic thing. The other thing that I really hadn't seen the data around was how much the impact of the American Care Act has had on health coverage. So the other thing is really the health coverage, which is at historic highs. And if you look about like 2023, 24, the uninsured rate, so people who don't have access to healthcare, is something like 8%. Where before the American Care Act, like 2010, that was double. The percentage was like 16%. So that's important for us as a community to make sure people have access to healthcare, so they can get treatment when they need it. But it's also important for us as individuals to know that you don't have to live in fear of any kind of health event if you don't have access to critical care.
Absolutely. So, we're going to switch into some of why we're being described as the most unhealthy population in modern history. We don't want to be negative about this. I think that we do want to, there are some opportunities, and it's doubling down on things we talk about all the time, and then really caring for a side and a group in our population that we just, as I think as a whole, have not done a great job of providing care for in the past, which leads to multiple issues.
Yeah. So if you look at the data on like, okay, so where are we dramatically worse off? No matter what time period, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, we are dramatically worse off on two fronts. One is obesity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like obesity is bad and getting worse by the minute,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like when you look at these stats.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of the broader category of just like general mental health, like mindset work, mental health, how are we processing things? And there's a ton of different inputs into all of that, but it seems like it boils down to, we've got this challenge that the science is helping us understand more about why it's such a big challenge around ultra processed foods. Like that's a real deal. We got to think through the access to not have to get ultra processed food. Never mind if you're in a income bracket where you can't afford anything but ultra processed food. Even if you're in an income bracket where you can afford better food, being able to know what that is and how to find it and then how to keep it that way with the environmental factors is a real question. And then on the mental health front, there are so many inputs into this that feel like they just are going to have a hard time changing, because there's a lot of them are related to tech and screens and things that are new to our cohort and our community that we have not figured out the right way to balance in a practical way.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that whole idea of community. You look at, let's take kids for example. You look at childhood when we were growing up, right? You were outside. You were on your bike. You didn't have a phone or a screen, but there was also this feeling that the world was a safer place, right? And so I think our parents worried, but it wasn't this hyper acute worry that we see today.
Yeah.
I think so multifactorial, right? So it's like we have things on our bodies that give us information every minute of every day, right?
Yeah.
And you just push things, whether or not you even want to go dig for it. And so it creates this feeling of, for so many people, unease, which I think contributes to both of these factors, right? It's like we don't go outside and play as much. Economic times, good or bad, is parents might be working one or more jobs. Kids are at home, and because there's not safe places to go outside, or we're worried about kids going outside, or we have too many screens, regardless, to incentivize kids to go outside. So they're sedentary, right? And we feel good because we know they're safe at home when we're off doing our thing, etc. And then it contributes to the mental health too.
Yeah.
Loneliness, a little bit of isolation, and then these algorithms feeding our
Whatever their anxiety is. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, kind of related to this idea of, we're actually not the sickest that we've ever been is another kind of point of view that came across the research was this perception, because we all have it, right, of nostalgia. Like, we were so much better in the 90s. We were so much better in the 80s. We were so much
Yeah.
safer. And it just brings the data forth. It's like, actually, no, we were, there's higher criminal rates, bigger such, but our perception has been just overfed that we're in this terrible moment in time. So what do we do with that, right? On the obesity front, it's all of the activity and all of the motion and all of the, keep active that we can get going. And it's trying to have an efficient and affordable way to access clean food and just actually know what it is. We talked in one of our prior episodes where I was like, gosh, I guess this food is processed because it survived us being gone for 3 weeks in
Right.
Portugal. So therefore it's processed,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, so I was so inspired. This weekend I had a little downtime where I was in between my Uber shifts as plain mom. And so I went for a walk in an area that I don't usually walk in, kind of outside of my normal community, and was so inspired by the run club that was running by me. And I mean, there were probably over 100 people
Oh,
on a
awesome.
Saturday in different groups. The fast group went by me first, and then the next group, and to the group of walkers that was at the end. But all of these people out in nature, moving their bodies and connecting. And I was like, it doesn't cost anything. It didn't cost a person other than time, right? And so it was just great to see. It was such a great example that just kind of really motivated me over the weekend to say, these communities exist. We just have to go look for them that tackle and provide opportunity in a lot of these areas that we're worried about, about connecting and moving our bodies and having a safe place and feeling safe doing it, and making a new friend.
Yeah. Yeah. So, movement, clean food, and the mental health one is a massive conundrum. We talk a lot about it with mindset and with community and friendships. So we don't have a solve per se in this one, but those are the two that I think we would look at the data and go, yeah, we actually are worse off than we've ever been, right? Obesity is like 40 to 45% of US adults. And I don't remember what the number is in kids, but it's pretty high as well. Yeah. And then the drug overdose deaths, that is actually higher than it's ever been historically. And then suicide rates. So that's a challenge to think about how to tackle the mental health problem, but that feels like way worth our time and energy to focus on the mental health problem and the clean food problem and keep the motion thing going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. And I think, and it takes communities coming together to tackle those problems, right? There's not one right solution. I think it all builds, right? From the very kind of medicalized, clinicalized solution of access to mental health care providers, correct medications, et cetera. But it really does filter down that if we can start to curb some of this rise in anxiety and depression that maybe stems from these other problems, right? Of not having a sense of community, not having a sense of connection, not having a place to go move your body that it feels safe and protected. And so if we can, start these interventions at a low kind of grassroots level, we might be able to do some prevention or limit the degree that people tend to worsen with.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think, our overall message today was one of hope, which is, there's a lot to celebrate, right?
Yeah.
We're living longer. And for most of that population that's living longer, their health span is better through that as well. Cancer rates are down, heart deaths are down, and an absolute and a percentage basis on both. Screenings are supporting that, as well as the way we treat the disease, which are science-based treatments, is helping. Vaccines, massively reducing or eradicating infant mortality. So lots to celebrate in the what's working well in our generation. And then focus on what really needs the focus, which is clean foods, getting more motion in our day-to-day lives, and mental health.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, I think just to kind of close this out, I do think that there's so much positive to look forward to. And it doesn't matter really, one great thing is that everybody's talking about this right now. It doesn't really matter what side you're on, at least the conversations are starting. And so let's continue to have those conversations and learn from each other, right? Because I think that's a really important piece, that these topics are often perceived as very divisive, and that we are dividing ourselves and you have to be in one camp or the other. And I really invite, if you disagree with what we're saying, send us a note. We'd love to chat with you. I think that I always learn something, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just glad that there might be an opportunity to have a conversation and understand one side versus the other. So I would say that there is a lot of attention around some of these topics right now, and we would invite people to engage in really productive, collaborative discussions about it and learn from each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I love chatting with you.
All right. We'll talk to you everybody soon. Take care.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us here today. If you liked what you heard and you got some tips on how to live better right now and for the long haul, please help us reach more midlife women. Please share and rate and like this show. And we can't wait to continue the dialogue with you on our next episode. Until then, thank you. It's time.